Hey everybody, it's your old pal Snowboarding PocketStation, and welcome to yet another volume of Japan-only PlayStation games, the never-ending wheelbase show hosted by a funny Irish man whose soul is trapped inside a Snowboarding PocketStation. As per usual, we'll be looking at 4 Japan-only PS1 games from a selection submitted to the almighty purveyor of random chance, Senior Wheel. And it's got some fun ones in store for you today, so let's get this wheel a spinning and these games, providing.
You will provide.
Oh yes, our very first game is Oh No, which made it to the PlayStation at the tail end of the year 2000, and yes, it is as strange as it looks. This game was chosen for us today by the lovely Navid Mohebi, and since I know Navid is a connoisseur of the old Japan-exclusive games himself, you can bet we're probably in for something fun, so let's dive in and see what Oh No is all about. Now, first things first, this game comes from a rather obscure developer called Tycoon Games Corp, who mostly have credits working on other projects with publisher Asmik Ace. Now, Moby Games does say that they developed the strange Ring game on the Dreamcast, and if that's true, that can only be a good thing. Although, notably, Oh No is also a collaboration with TBS. No, not the American TBS, which I only really know because of Conan and AEW, but instead, we're talking about the Japanese TBS, the Tokyo Broadcasting System, which I know even less about, but they did help out with this game by getting one of their top news anchors to narrate the thing. Here he is on the back of the box. His name is Shiro Suzuki, by the way. Let's just check in his Wikipedia to learn a bit more about him. And, oh no. Hey, wait a minute, that's the name of the game. And here it is, Oh No in all its colourful, arcadey auto-runner glory, a style of game that has been pretty resilient over the years, whether it was back in the golden age of the arcades, or just if you need a game to play in the background while you're watching 3 videos at the same time. There is always a market for auto-runners. Now, the PlayStation was kind of the renaissance of auto-runners, if you think about it. I mean, Crash took running into the screen and away from the screen, into the next dimension. I mean, none of that out-of-date moose bullshit here. We're fleeing from polygons now, bitch. There's also Pepsi Man, which you think would have shown up in one of these videos by now, but hey, it is only a matter of time, and whenever that does show up, believe me, I ain't gonna get Final Destination in this game. There would be Pepsi everywhere, and that would upset me greatly. So, long story short, auto-runners are pretty fun, and good news, this one right here might just be one of the very best, even though the gameplay here still focuses on auto-scrolling your way right to the end of the stage by dodging hazards. The big difference here is that you control a number of characters at once, anywhere from 2 to 4 simultaneously, and you can freely change to a horizontal or vertical formation at any time simply by just tapping a button. And when you consider the stage layouts, hazards, pickups, and combo system are all built around carefully managing these formations, well, you can see that this is a more complex and technical auto-runner than most, and that's a funny thing to say, considering how unserious the rest of this game is. So the story here focuses on the Oh No family, who are, let's just say, a little bit odder than the average Japanese family. I mean, all the stars are here. Crazy grandparents, pervy dad, a strange bald child in white shorts who likes getting his butt out. This is the star of the game, by the way, brother, not to be confused with his actual brother and cousin who also look just like him. You'll be controlling these 3 kids for the majority of the game as they get up to all sorts of crazy situations. And I do mean crazy. I mean, there is stuff in this game that is maybe a little bit too on the weird side of Japanese culture for me to really appreciate, but there is no denying there are a lot of colorful characters to meet in this wacky world, let me tell you. Once you get into the game, well, it's 10 levels of running towards and away from things. At the top of the screen, there is a health bar which slowly drains as you move throughout the level, and if you bump into any people or obstacles, you also lose a chunk of health. And if this happens to run out before you reach the end, well, you guessed it, it's a game over. Something you might be seeing quite a lot of during this game, as there are also plenty of one-hit kill hazards like pits, and you know, just getting straight up hit by a car. And unfortunately, even though we got 3 of these little guys, and we probably wouldn't miss one of them if they fell down a hole, if you do drop one of them down a hole, that is enough to trigger a game over. Luckily, the penalty for a game over is just getting your score cut in 2 and then resetting with half your life at the last checkpoint. So as long as you don't care about score, you can make as many mistakes as you like, and I assure you, you will probably make a few mistakes. Now, while you can't do much about getting hit by a car or stuck behind a wall and disappearing into the void, you can sort out that health bar up top. As you've probably seen, throughout each level there are a number of burgers to pick up. Hamburgers that give you points and health, and fish burgers that reduce your health. And believe me, if you want to finish a level, you'll want to focus on these bad boys, as hitting a few too many fish burgers or missing some hamburgers can easily leave you in the dirt. So as you can see, with so many things to dodge as well as items to collect, and on top of that, keeping an eye on your formations, this can be a pretty intense game at times, let me tell you. And while a lot of these auto runners can be pretty tough, this one requires a good eye, good reactions, and ideally a good memory, especially if you're after a high score, since jumping on multiple enemies in a row is how you earn big combos and subsequently get yourself a top score. So it can be a lot to manage, but in saying that, it's all these additional things that I think gives Oh No a leg up gameplay wise, because the additional mechanical depth and skill ceiling make it a very satisfying game to get good at. Chaining hamburgers while jumping and dodging fish and explosions, it's tough, but very satisfying when it all comes together. My only real issue is that it can be pretty difficult to judge the depth of jumps, which may lead to a few nasty fish burger surprises, or worse, but it is something that you will get used to over time. Now, while the 10 levels give us some nice variety both in the locations and hazards, they all fundamentally play the same. Where things change up, however, is at the end of each stage, where instead of fighting a boss, you get to take part in one of 2 different mini-games, a simple rhythm game where you press inputs as they appear on screen, or a button bashing mini-game, which is most certainly a button bashing minigame. You get rewarded a bunch of extra points depending on how well you do here, but as far as I know, you can't actually fail them. So if you have no rhythm or just suck at pushing buttons, you are safe here. And while these segments don't really offer anything new or exciting gameplay wise, the visuals and music during these segments really are something. In fact, presentation wise, this whole game is really cooking. I mean, the gameplay here is pretty good for what it is, but for me, I think Oh No is a game you want to play because of the way it looks and sounds. Like, this is a game where you can kind of see the energy and vibe it gives off through the screen, right? I mean, nobody is moving like this unless the music is banging. Visually, the game goes for a mixture of 3D rendered environments and 2D sprites for the items and characters. It's a look that is very similar to Parappa the Rapper, but since this is a rather late release on the PlayStation, I think the implementation here is a little cleaner than Parappa's overall, and the variety of different characters and the number appearing on screen at once is all very impressive too. And while the different gameplay elements are repeated throughout the game, you can always expect enough visual changes and variety to make it feel fresh all over again, and all at a stable 30 FPS. So on a visual and tech level, there's really very little default here. It's even got anime cutscenes and plenty of mid-game story segments, which I would show you more of, but I assure you they get very, very strange. Although, as always, as seems to be the case with games I play, the music really is the standout in this thing. Oh No has such a wildly eclectic soundtrack with original vocal-heavy tracks covering punk, reggae, Caribbean, doo-wop, ska, and pretty much every track is good. And better yet, at the end of each level, the minigames usually remix the song too, which I always do love to see. And honestly, even if you're not necessarily into this type of game, I'd say it's worth checking out just to experience the manic audio-visual experience that it offers. It really is good shit. Anyway, that's a look at Oh No, a pretty simple game at its core, but with enough gameplay depth and visual flair to make it an easy recommendation for fans of arcade experiences on the console. It's relatively import friendly outside of the Japanese in the menus, but it's nothing a bit of Google Lens won't fix. It takes roughly an hour or two to beat the 10 main story levels, and good news, once you do, there's plenty more to unlock, including a tougher mode with no checkpoints where you play as some of the girls from the story, and the girl levels also get their own exclusive remixes of some of the music, and believe me, this shit is real good too. There's also a fun mode you unlock after beating the girl mode where your health bar is gone and you now rack up points by rolling into people. Seriously, this might actually be the best mode in the game. And there's also some cool multiplayer modes where you can test your love compatibility with your partner by seeing how good you can play Oh No together. Is it true love or are you on your way to a divorce? Finally, we have found a perfectly accurate method to determine this. So yeah, if you like what you see, it's an easy recommendation from me. It is a little pricey to pick up physically these days, but hey, that's the auto-runner tax, I guess. So only one question remains. What's the better Japan exclusive runner? Is it Oh No or is it Pepsi Man? Well, we're gonna have to wait until we cover Pepsi Man in one of these videos to find out. But for now at least, as long as the game features you being chased by an out-of-control vehicle, it's pretty good in my book.
You will provide.
(2097年7月) 新人類未知に対し人類世界連合はアリアドネ作戦を発動した。
Next up, we have a game with a very cool name, and that's Speed Power Gunbike, which made it to the PlayStation in April of the year 1998. This game was chosen for us today by three fine folks, them being Gino746, Chasing Perspective, and Chris Cash Money. And this is a game that I've been interested in trying for a little while now, because back in Volume 10 of this series, we played a game called Love and Destroy that was a hybrid of mech action and dating sim that was simultaneously one of the coolest and most disappointing entries entries that I've played in any of these videos. I mean, there's so many cool ideas, such incredible presentation, but when it came to the gameplay, beyond the incredible opening mission, Love and Destroy just kinda falls apart into a mess of bad levels, bad boss fights, and incredibly frustrating gameplay and camera controls. Now, this was the second game released by a developer called Inti-Creates, a company started by ex-Capcom devs who are sick of making Mega Man games, and funnily enough ended up mostly making Mega Man games anyway. And even despite its flaws, you could still see the incredible talent and potential Inti-Creates had within Love and Destroy. It's just clear that when it came to moving from 2D to 3D, they had a few teething issues along the way. But what about their very first game as a studio? Well, that of course is Speed Power Gunbike, a game that, like Love and Destroy, was a collaboration with Sony themselves. Well, Sony Music Entertainment Japan, not to be confused with Sony Computer Entertainment Japan, which are in fact completely different, and this is why trying to make a video covering all the Sony games on the PlayStation is a logistical nightmare. Now, Speed Power Gunbike, I won't lie to you, I have played briefly before. If you've ever seen clips or images of this game, like its cool box art or character select screen, this whole thing just kinda screams, play me. The problem, however, is that when you play it, the average first impression is usually somebody saying "oh no" repeatedly for 5 minutes, and not the good "oh no," the bad kind of "oh no."
Oh no.
The type that usually makes you quit a game after those first 5 minutes, and well, at least that was my experience anyway, and based off of my brief hands-on experience a few years back, and more recently my poor experience with Love and Destroy, well, let's just say my expectations for this game are a bit lower than most, but every game gets a fresh chance, and Speed Power Gunbike is no different, so let's see how it holds up. Now, first off, I should probably explain the basic gameplay of this thing, which is once again Inti-Creates thinking that it would be cool to do a mech action game, but also combine it with another genre of video game, and in this case we have a mech action / racing game. I know, that sounds pretty cool, right? And I guess simply by looking at the game in action, it also looks pretty cool, right? Well, the thing is, very few games on the PlayStation have the learning curve this game has. It's not necessarily that this is a complicated game to play, it only uses a few buttons and a D-pad after all. It's just in terms of movement and ease of control, this game feels almost alien to play in a way. I always refer to this thing called game sense, which is just the idea that if you've played enough video games, you should be able to determine the logical controls for a game based off of your previous experience playing other similar games in the past. You see, a lot of games share similar control schemes because over time a favored method usually rises to the top, and there you go, that's just how most games in the genre control now. Back in the early 3D days, however, those standards hadn't really been set. So sometimes you'll play a PS1 game and expect it to control a certain way, and then when it doesn't, your brain just kinda craps out on you and you basically need to learn the game from scratch. Speed Power Gunbike is one of those games, and this applies to pretty much every aspect of its gameplay, whether you're simply just driving around, fighting in a mech, or driving around and fighting in a mech. This game requires a bit of patience and dedication, and that's why it's a good thing they added a training mission, which I 100% recommend trying before you start this game, because you will immediately discover Speed Power Gunbike's biggest issue, which is how incredibly rigid the movement is in this thing. Driving for the most part is what you'd expect. You've got an accelerate and brake button, and you can also do a little power slide using the L1 or R1 buttons, and that is all well and good, but even if you're good at driving games, I feel like you might struggle a bit here, because even though you can get used to this game's movement, I cannot say it's very good. You're gonna crash into a lot of things, struggle with tight corners, grapple with whatever it is the drift button does, and also whenever you crash into things, this game likes to make you bounce around a shit ton, which just makes the process a whole lot worse. And to make things more confusing, you also have two different driving modes called Bike and Rally, which also have different speed and grip values, and you can freely swap between these by pressing up or down on the D-pad, and both of these modes are a little bit tricky to get used to. Then of course there's your mech mode, which you can transform into freely by pressing the square button, where the controls now also change up quite a bit, and you now move via the directional pad and by boosting using the X button. And also the camera mode changes here too, and there's also no camera controls, which make things that a little bit more fun, and by fun, I mean awful. While in mech mode, you can press triangle to attack, X to boost in the direction you're facing, and you can also hold circle to block, and if you press the attack button while blocking, you can use your gun weapon, which is quite slow to take out and even slower to aim, but pretty powerful against the right kind of enemies. Now, if you had to learn one of these movement types, I'd say it would take a little while to get used to, but it is doable for sure. The difficulty here, however, is that you need to learn all 3 movement types, assess which type is best for the correct situation, be able to swap them on the fly, and also make use of their specific special abilities too, of which there are quite a few. And look, my first playthrough of this game, from the training mission to the very end when the credits rolled, was such a clusterfuck of control issues, me hitting the wrong buttons, making stupid decisions, swapping into the wrong mode, and also getting my ass flung off a bike and having to road rash run my way back while tanks are shooting at me. I won't lie, it was pretty rough. And this is why my choice to preemptively assume I'd be bad at the game and select very easy for my first run through was a pretty smart decision, because despite me sucking terribly, the difficulty here is so low that it allowed me to make as many mistakes as I liked and not really be punished for it. And the one good thing that came from my mistakes is that I learned not to make them again. Not always, mind you, but usually after the 3rd, 4th, or I don't know, 15th time, it does start to sink in. And look, even though the process of playing through the game and getting to the end credits was rough to say the least, by the end I did kind of understand the ebb and flow of the game, and while there's no denying the controls, camera and movement in this thing aren't very good, even by PlayStation standards, I did have some grasp on them now, and after seeing the game through from start to finish, unlike Love and Destroy, which I think starts strong and ends poorly, this game kinda has the opposite effect, where the initial impression is atrocious, but the more you play it and the better you understand it, the better it gets. So let me break down exactly how you're meant to play this game the right way. We've got 3 playable characters who all control the same, but have different values for their various mech and vehicle modes. You've got the red boy, Ippei, who's a bit of an all-rounder, decent speed and decent control, and is probably a good choice for a first playthrough. Next up we have Amy, the powder doll, whatever that means. She probably has the best grip and movement in the game, but lacks a little bit of speed and power in her mech mode, but she also has the best gun weapon in the game, so that's nice. And finally we have X, the Black Rider. This guy is the strongest and fastest of the characters, but by far has the most rigid movement in the game, so definitely one to pick after you've had a bit more experience, but he does have double machine guns and a laser sword, so he is worth the wait. Anyway, once you've picked your character, you've got to get through 5 racing stages and about 7 boss fights to beat the game, although the majority of your playthrough will be focused on these racing stages, where the goal is to get from point A to point B before this timer in the top left counts down. This is your energy counter, which reads like some form of angry energy, but when you say it out loud, it kind of sounds more like anal energy, so that's kind of weird. This also counts as your health, by the way, so if you take any damage during the level by, say, getting shot, crashing into a mine, or one of the many awkwardly placed energy fences, this timer will drop down and make your life a whole lot more stressful. Naturally, there's a few pickups throughout the level that will restore your energy, and these are pretty important, by the way, especially on later difficulties, but worst case scenario, if you do run out of time, you're gonna get yourself a game over, but luckily you can restart from the beginning of the level, but with your score reset, as was the style at the time. Now you might ask yourself, if we have a time limit, would it not just be best to stick to the speedier modes of transport? And yeah, ideally in this game, you'll want to be going as fast as you possibly can, and for each character, that's what the bike mode is for, which not only has a much higher top speed than the other modes, but you can also hold up while at top speed and unlock an even higher speed, kinda like Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, if anybody has played that. The thing with bike mode though, is that your movement is very limited, it has crap starting acceleration, and also if you get hit while in bike mode, you'll get knocked off your bike, and the faster you're going when you get hit, the further the run back to your bike is. And I probably don't need to tell you, in a game based around being as quick as you possibly can, this shit right here, well, that's no good. This is where rally mode comes into play. Rally mode is much slower than bike mode, but its strength lies in its acceleration and grip, both of which are much better than bike mode. This means rally mode is much better in tight and winding corridors, in which this game has a rather large amount, and seriously, while the levels are generally pretty linear in flow, some of these segments can get straight up maze-like in design, so being able to turn on command is a pretty big benefit. Another big benefit of rally mode is that unlike bike mode, where getting hit sends you blasting off like Team Rocket, rally mode can push through damage without you getting fired out of your vehicle, meaning it's a much safer, albeit slower mode of transport, and knowing when to pivot from rally to bike mode and vice versa is really the secret sauce of playing this game well, and I guess that means the mech mode is pretty much exclusively used for combat, right? Well, actually, the mech mode is by far the best mode of transport in the game for most situations, really. Well, specifically thanks to its boost ability, which not only lets you get high speeds almost instantaneously, but also damages enemies and obstacles too. Sadly, unlike your vehicles, your mech can overheat from using a bit too much boost, but even still, when in doubt, spamming boost is rarely a bad idea, and better still, if you transform from a vehicle going at high speed into your mech mode, you unleash an even more powerful boost attack, and the faster you're going while doing this, the more damage this does. And since levels have numerous enemies and obstacles to overcome, the best way of doing this is pretty much by transforming from a vehicle into a mech, briefly steamrolling through the enemies, and then transforming back into the vehicle mode to do it all over again. And when you get this down, it really does become quite satisfying. Now, the other big benefit of destroying enemies is that it gives you points, and since this is a game from the 90s, high scores were still king, and with a scoring system that not only rewards finishing levels quickly, but also for destroying enemies, aptly labeled your speed and power score, not to mention you can get chain bonuses for destroying multiple enemies with one attack, well, you start to see the ideas in this game really coming together. Also, killing enemies and getting chain bonuses are how you bump up your G power meter here in the bottom left, which allows you to use super attacks. Now, you can do this by holding down the attack button and spinning the D-pad clockwise, which lets you use a very powerful gun attack for 1 bar, or you can hold the attack button and press the up button a few times, which lets you do this other weird flying attack that costs 3 bars of your meter, and I've never once been able to control it well enough to harm anybody with it. So yeah, maybe just use the gun attack for the beginning, which you also should be saving for bosses, of which there are many. Now, bosses in this game are where I think the gameplay elements are at their best and worst. They have the potential to be very frustrating early on and show how limited the combat can be, but also some of the design choices here are really quite interesting and very well implemented, and when you manage to overcome the controls and pull off some wild shit, these bosses are where the game really makes you feel like a god. The first boss, this 4-legged armored tank, is probably the highlight of the game, if I'm being honest. You drive around this circular arena, crashing into the tank's legs to knock it off balance, and then you can drive around again and speed up and crash into its head, and when you do it right, it just looks incredibly cool, and I won't lie, it's also pretty damn fun to pull off as well. Sadly, most of the other bosses aren't as interesting as this one, but each one does offer up variants to the formula, which is more or less avoid damage, pick up speed, and then crash into this fucker at the opportune time. You do it with a big armored train driving through a tunnel, a big whale thing, and even with 2 small robots that combine to form a bigger robot. All the classics are here. Although as the difficulty increases and time becomes more of a luxury, you'll soon learn the limitations of this game's combat, which is to say most of your abilities like basic attacks, blocking, taking out the gun and very slowly aiming it are kind of useless, as the best attacks in this game is simply just crashing into things with your mech, either by using basic dashes or the big dashes while transforming at speed. But generally, the amount of time that it actually takes to pick up speed and do a big charge, you can probably get the same effect by simply doing lots of little dashes, which you can perform much quicker and also use to stun lock enemies. This is especially useful against the bosses that are immune to gun specials, specifically this fucking guy, but in general, outside of specific scenarios, simply slowing down and just spamming the attack button is a recipe for disaster, so when in doubt, just boost into whatever is blocking your way, and you should be good to go. So that's kind of the general gameplay experience in a nutshell, but what about the story? Why are we doing all this? Well, I'll be honest with you, I have no idea. This game does have a decent number of cutscenes, all fully voiced by the way, but there are no subtitles, so I can't really translate what's going on. And look, even if I could tell you what's going on, this game gets pretty damn weird and out there too. Indie curates definitely like to pay homage to some other famous mecha and anime series out there, but once again, similar to Love and Destroy, this game is probably most influenced by Evangelion, and I know that may not seem immediately obvious from the gameplay, but if you've seen the latter parts of this game, it becomes very apparent and also very weird. But look, as somebody who likes when games just kind of go off the rails into unusual places, Speed Power Gunbike certainly subverts expectations by the end, let me tell you. Now, there is slight changes to the story depending on what character you're playing as, specifically a boss fight in the middle of the game, but either way, as somebody who couldn't really appreciate the plot here, it was still quite a fun trip to take and look at. And unlike Love and Destroy, where the plot and characters are a bit more integral to the gameplay, the flow of Speed Power Gunbike is pretty much just level based and very arcadey, so if you wanted to play this thing just for the gameplay, You very much can, and other than the story, the rest of the game is pretty much entirely in English, so you're good to go. All in all, it takes about an hour to beat the game and see the credits, and once you're done, the main goal is really just trying the other characters, getting a higher score, and playing on the higher difficulty. So all in all, a pretty typical short arcadey action mech racing experience from the 90s. And is this the case where if you simply learn the controls and struggle through the learning curve, does this game suddenly become good? Well, yes and no. Look, I won't deny this is a game where if you understand what it wants you to do, how you're meant to play it, and the specific quirks of its gameplay and movement, there is legitimately a very fun and often exciting game here at times. But even still, I can't deny the game's controls and the rigidness and inconsistency of the movement. It is just not good. It wasn't good then, and it certainly isn't good now, but that doesn't mean you can't get good at it, although even when I felt comfortable with the controls, there was rarely a run where something bizarre or awkward didn't happen, and by the time I was playing on normal difficulty and I could play the game pretty well, the timer became so strict that even making the smallest mistake can cost you a level. And with controls like these, well, some mistakes are sadly inevitable, and the occasional bout of frustration is just part of the experience, really. And don't even get me started on the unlockable hard mode. Shit just goes insane here. You can kind of liken this game to some of the rougher 3D Sonic games. It's incredibly cool when everything is going well, but inevitably, some weird bullshit is going to happen that just snaps you back into reality. And look, I can tolerate Sonic falling through rails on occasion because I think Sonic is cool, and I could also tolerate bumping off walls for eternity because I think being able to transform from a bike into a mech and crash into a tank is also quite cool. I like to think that everybody out there has a different jank to cool ratio that they can tolerate for their games, and Speed Power Gunbike is like the king of jank to cool. The ratios are off the charts for both, and while not many will be able to overcome the jank barrier in this thing, for those who can, this shit undoubtedly just kinda rules. Of course, on the other hand, we are yet to talk about the presentation, which I don't think anybody can deny is this game's high point. Just like with Love and Destroy, even if Inti Creates struggle in the gameplay department, aesthetically, this shit just slaps so hard. From the vehicle and mech designs for the different characters, the boss fights, the big set pieces, and even the cutscenes, this is a very nice looking game, which considering this is Inti Creates' first ever 3D title and a 98 release at that, is really quite impressive. Sure, some of the environments are a bit samey, and I would have liked to have seen a bigger variety of the basic enemy types, but throughout the game's runtime, you're going to see a lot of cool stuff and some very flashy effects, and all at a stable 30 FPS too. The UI and menus are also another big highlight here too. I especially enjoy the unique UI elements for each of the playable characters, such a small feature in games, but one that I really do love to see. Also, this character select screen, I gotta say, I really never get tired of this thing. I mean, being able to flip through the different vehicles, their different modes, and all the little meters and flashing lights, and even a screen in the back that's mirroring your screen, it's just buzzing with energy. And honestly, if you've ever seen this game before, seeing this character select screen do the rounds on social media is probably what piqued your interest in the first place, and believe me, it is good shit. Audio-wise, the game is hitting all the right notes too. As mentioned before, we got full voice acting, which sounds pretty good to my ears, and the vehicle and weapon effects all sound very punchy too. The mechs specifically have this really cool revving engine effect to them while in motion, and all the little audio-visual cues you get while transforming just add to the satisfaction of getting through a section perfectly. The music in this game I also thought was quite good, and there's a lot of it too, ranging from up-tempo beats for the racing sections to slower, more atmospheric tracks for some of the weirder scenes. If I had any complaints, it's just that there can often be a bit too much noise from all the effects that it kind of drowns out the music on occasion, but sound-wise, once again, when everything hits just right, it is undeniably cool.
マスオに。
人も未知も業の深さに変わりはないのだよ。網のことを言ってるのか。あれはただの作り物だ。いくらでも代わりの利く出来損ないの人形に過ぎん。
Also, I have to give a shout out to the level titles that are done like an episode of an anime alongside the contributing musical sting.
決戦せよ、ガンバイク特攻隊前編。
And also, we get a closing vocal track included as well. Come on, you don't get your game published by Sony Music Japan without getting a few vocal bangers included for funsies. So that was a look at Speed Power Gunbike, another janky mess from Integrates on the PlayStation, but one that I really grew to quite like by the end. I still think it has some very big problems that a lot of people out there are not going to be able to overlook, but if your tolerance for jank is higher than the average bear, well then maybe you too will grow to appreciate how rewarding and exciting this game can be when it all comes together. You're still going to hate it on occasion, but it is one of those games that is in fact as fun to play as it looks, when you can actually play it well. And I mean, conceptually alone, it's just kind of fucking cool, isn't it? Bikes transforming into mechs and crashing into demon whales, they sure don't make them like this anymore, let me tell you.
You will provide.
Doronbo! そうと決まれば。おやき、トンズラ、さっさとメカの支度をするんだよ。タイムボカンシリーズの真の主役がドロンボーだっていうことを全国に知らしめてやろうじゃないか。
なるほど先生。
ボカーンと一発。
Doronbo!
Kicking off the second half of Volume 16, we have a game which is a contender for the longest name featured in one of these videos so far, and it's Time Bokan series Bokan to Ippatsu Doronbo, which made it to the PlayStation in November of 1996. This game was chosen for us today by the lovely Rolita1, and let me tell you, this one is a fun one. What we have here is a 2D shoot 'em up and a licensed anime tie-in 2D shoot 'em up at that. For those unaware, Time Bokan is a long-running series from beloved animation studio Tatsunoko Productions. They're the one with the little seahorse logo and also that cool Capcom tie-in game. Now, Time Bokan first aired back in 1975 and focused on a bunch of kids traveling through time in their cool insect-shaped robots, and like many popular series, would go on to see various new iterations of the formula over the years, although the second Time Bokan series, Yatterman, which first aired in 1977, is probably the most well-known globally, and judging by the amount of Time Bokan video games that focus on this series in particular, I think it's safe to say it's probably the most well-known in Japan as well. Yatterman focuses on the masked heroes Yatterman 1 and 2, as well as their wide array of cool animal-based mechs as they search for fragments of a mysterious stone skull, which will apparently reveal the location to some secret treasure, as good a motivation for a show as any. Of course, also competing for these stone skulls are arguably the most popular and influential characters from this show, the Doronbo gang, a villainous trio comprising of the strongest trio formula, which is of course a sexy masked woman and two very ugly men. These guys also have their own array of animal-based mechs, which mostly serve as entertaining roadblocks for our heroes as they get blown up in increasingly funny ways. If this all sounds a little bit Team Rocket from Pokemon, you'd be right, as the Doronbo gang heavily influenced a lot of the early Team Rocket gags, and if you ever come across a villainous, comedic, and mildly incompetent trio in other cartoons, there's a good chance the Doronbo DNA is in there somewhere. Now, I won't lie, my experience with this series is pretty limited. I think I first came across it while playing Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, which was more so my introduction to the world of Tatsunoko as a whole, and what an introduction it was, because this game slaps hard. But of course, with a legacy series like Time Bokan, there has been plenty of games on various platforms over the years, in all sorts of fun and wacky genres, almost all of which were exclusive to Japan. And right here in the middle of all these, we have the PS1 debut of Time Bokan, and it's a 2D vertical scrolling shooter of all things, a genre I'm pretty much always in the mood for. So let's see what this bad boy is all about. Now, first things first, this was a game published by Banpresto and developed by a company called 11, who made a handful of games throughout the 90s, most notably a few Bomberman games, including Saturn Bomberman Fight, which recently got translated into English, so that's pretty fun. But beyond that, probably the most interesting thing about this game is that instead of playing as the good guys, this is a game starring the villains, the aforementioned Doronbo gang, and all the enemies and bosses you fight are the various Time Bokan heroes and robots from the different series of the show, be it the original Time Bokan duo, the Yatterman gang, or their other various time-traveling animal mech-based friends. And I gotta say, that's a nice little twist in a shoot-'em-up, I feel. I can't really recall many other games in the genre where you play from the perspective of the villains. Well, at least overtly. I'm sure there's a whole video essay in somebody's head about the themes of Einhander, but it ain't me, that's for sure. My head is exclusively reserved for barnyard music. As for the actual plot of the game, there does seem to be one, and it's told via some anime cutscenes that are all fully voiced and appear sporadically between missions, although unless you understand spoken Japanese, once again you'll be missing out on any of the story reasons for why you're blowing up a giant robot dog and its army of smaller robot ants. But not to worry, the game itself follows the usual arcade-style shooter flow with 7 linear levels, each featuring new locations as well as a spattering of bosses and mini-bosses, and you can also play with a buddy if you like. What's not to love? Now, as mentioned, this is a vertical scrolling shoot-'em-up, mostly aligned to the shoot-'em-up genre, but with a little horizontal screen movement added in for fun. The game also features a bunch of different locales and terrain types, with ground, sea, and air sections throughout. And while these terrains don't really affect the gameplay in any way, it is nice to see the mechs adapt to and change to suit the terrain types that you're on, and even react to changes in elevation, which is some nice attention to detail. And speaking of the mechs, the Doronbo gang have quite a lot of them, 6 to be exact, each one with their own shot types, movement speeds, and ultimate mech transformation modes, which are pretty great. The different mechs each offer up a variety of the usual shoot-'em-up archetypes, from bullets to spread shots and lasers, etc. So really it's just a case of finding your favorite and then going to town on the enemies. But to help spice things up, the game doesn't let you use the same mech 2 levels in a row, meaning you've got to go back and pick a new one before the start of each level, which personally I felt was a nice addition to have just for variety and flexibility's sake. But better still, about halfway through the game, you also unlock an additional 3 vehicles, each one designed around a member of the Doronbo gang, giving you a total of 9 different choices altogether. And with the ability to swap between these each level, it certainly makes for a variety-filled playthrough, that's for sure. I mean, you can't even try them all in one run, and as soon as I beat the game, I immediately wanted to go back in and test the ones that I had missed, so definitely a positive addition in my eyes. As for the controls of the mechs themselves, well, that's the same no matter what you pick. You've got your standard auto shot that we all know and love, and there's also a bomb function which deals massive damage to enemies in a wide radius, as was the style at the time. Now, interestingly, bombs in this game are infinite, and you can pretty much use them all the time, and believe me, you should be using them as they both do big damage and are key for getting big combos and high scores. And while having infinite bombs does sound kinda OP, they actually managed to balance it quite well in this game, simply by having bombs obscure your vision on screen, and also by giving bombs a short cooldown before arming and being ready to launch. But Sean, that still sounds pretty OP, doesn't it? And yeah, it would be if bombs didn't also tie into this game's dodge system. You see, each player can perform a little barrel roll to the left or right using the L1 and R1 buttons, which is not only cool because everybody loves a barrel roll, but it also makes you temporarily invulnerable and able to avoid damage from attacks if timed well. This is also pretty OP if you're good at this sort of stuff, but as a trade-off, if you are arming a bomb or currently have a bomb attached to your ship, you cannot barrel roll, and believe me, there are certain sections in this game where you will need to barrel roll. So if you're throwing out bombs willy-nilly like some sort of idiot who doesn't even know how to play the game, you're probably going to suffer for it. And I think this is a really clever way of balancing this game by giving you 2 very strong, arguably OP abilities, but only ever giving you access to 1 at a time. And if you make the wrong choice, you might not only miss a huge point scoring opportunity, you might just outright die for being too greedy, and I like that the game is always making me think about this in the back of my mind, but not to the degree where it felt like it overly distracts from the fun and chaos on screen, you know? As for everything else, well, there's various power-ups that boost your attack. It's a nice simple system where all your options, additional weapons, etc. are defined by whichever mech you choose, and it's simply just a case of leveling up from 1 to 5 to get to max power. There's also point pickups and power downs in the form of these Yatterman hats, which you'll definitely want to avoid, and interestingly there's no lives in this game. Instead you have a simple health bar, which might as well be your lives in health bar form, because if it runs out, it's a game over, although you can use a continue to start again from wherever you were, but with a reduction to your score. This all sounds very familiar. Now don't worry, if you're kind of bad, you can start the game with 50 continues if you like, which is honestly one of the highest numbers I've seen a game let you choose by default. But better still, if you run out of life, you might live yet as the Doronbo gang turn into their ultimate form, the 3-person tandem bicycle. Unsurprisingly, this is very weak and will die in one hit, but if you manage to survive long enough in this mode and find a health pickup, you can fully turn things around and get back on track, which is a pretty nice mechanic, I thought. And let's be fair, a shoot 'em up with a tandem bicycle, that's just good shit. As for scoring, well, I already mentioned combos and bombs are the name of the game here. Ideally, you want to kill as many enemies on screen with a single bomb as you can, and the more you kill, the bigger your score. But another benefit of killing lots of enemies at once are these skull tokens that drop from enemies. Silver tokens give you 1 point and gold gives you 5 points, and when this little counter in the top left reaches 100, that's how you transform into your cool big ultimate mech mode, which not only makes you invincible but allows you to go to town on pretty much everything on screen. Now, truthfully, the attacks in this mode are more or less the same no matter which mech you pick. It's basically just a case of getting on top of the enemy and then spamming punch MMA style, and hey, you're good to go. Although be wary, as soon as this counter reaches 100, you automatically transform, and if you time this poorly, like transforming just before a boss fight, well, you're gonna make life a lot harder for yourself, so you better think wisely when hoovering up these skull tokens. And yeah, that's pretty much the game in a nutshell, really. It's a pretty standard shoot 'em up, but with a surprising amount of fun little features and gimmicks that manage to give the game its own flavor and identity. And even when I think about it, the levels themselves, and especially the various bosses and mini-bosses, they're all quite strong in this game too. Like, there's lots of visual variety, some really nice set pieces and transitions, and the bosses range from these big mechanical fortresses to just straight up mech battles, and it kind of feels like it combines the best of both worlds, from the shoot-'em-up and standard shoot-'em-up worlds, and the fact they nailed this in a licensed Yatterman tie-in too is really quite impressive. Now granted, not everything here is a success. There's one gimmick level in particular where you're trying to follow the track like a racing game, which does seem kind of fun on paper, but the execution here is just not great and will likely lead to a few unnecessary deaths, and some of the environments and bosses do look a little bit more filler than some of the others. But seriously, all in all, this is a game that is very easy to like whether you're a Time Bokan fan or not. And while the gameplay certainly plays a big part in that, it's the beautiful and colorful 2D presentation that really is the star of the show here. I mean, if you look back on this generation, you'll see that 95 to 98 was probably the peak for really good looking, high fidelity 2D games on this hardware. And I don't really mean in terms of visual quality, more so the number of developers willing to invest in high quality 2D experiences, something that really began to dry out when the Dreamcast came in to replace the Saturn. And as an example of a good-looking 32-bit 2D game, this is certainly one of the better examples you will find on the PlayStation. I mean, we've got numerous sprites on screen, lots of fun effects like scaling and rotations, and all of this is running at a rock-solid 60 FPS. It's pretty much exactly what you'd want from a 2D game on the PlayStation, and I probably don't even need to elaborate on what I mean by that. All you need to do is look at it and you're like, hell yeah, this shit rules. Sadly, I can't say the same for the anime cutscenes, which are certainly some of the lower quality ones I've seen in a CD-based game of the era, both in visual and audio quality, but they do get the job done. And speaking of the audio, thankfully for the most part, it's good news here too. The music is inspired by the show and definitely sounds like a hybrid of 70s anime and shoot 'em up, which is the vibe you'd want. And the sound effects are also very plentiful and lively, although one of my bigger complaints for this game is that the voice effects for the characters do repeat a lot during the levels, and there's this one sound effect that plays on repeat when you're in the tandem bike mode that is so distracting and honestly kind of annoying that it sometimes makes me want to kill myself in bike mode so I don't have to hear it anymore, which is quite bad. But beyond that, everything else sound-wise is pretty great, and the music even goes pretty hard on occasion, and when this game goes hard, I love to hear it. So yeah, that was a look at Time Bokan series Bokan to Ippatsu Doronbo, a very enjoyable arcade-style shooter, and honestly one that I think has flown a little under the radar really. Like, don't get me wrong, do I think this is one of the all-time greats? Probably not. I mean, there's plenty of other shooters I'd rank above this one on a mechanical and presentation level, but for a licensed anime tie-in game that both plays and looks this good, you really can't ask for much better now, can you? If you happen to be a fan of both Yatterman and shoot-em-ups, this is basically a dream game, and as for everybody else, if you're looking for a fun, easy-to-play, arcade-style vertical shooter with bright, colourful visuals, some fun gimmicks, and a catchy soundtrack, this is an easy recommendation for everybody. Although for the Saturn fans out there, this game did also see a release on that console, but since that version came out nearly a year later in 1997, the Saturn version also includes a few bonus extras, most notably a whole additional level and boss. So while the PS1 original is certainly a great game in its own right, the enhanced Saturn port would be the one to go for if you had to pick between the two. But worry not, PlayStation fans, as this game would see a PS1 exclusive follow-up a little bit later in 1998, also developed by 11, which is pretty much more of the same, only they fixed that issue I had with the bike sound effect, and it also now lets you activate your transformations via button, which is much better. Normally this is where I'd say we could hope to check it out in a future episode of the series, but alas, this second entry isn't a Japan-only exclusive, as the game did see a very limited PAL release in the 2000s, although exclusively in Italy, because Italians were way ahead of the curve when it came to importing anime into Europe, and as a result, Yatterman is incredibly popular over there, so yeah, there you go. I guess we could always check out the Time Bokan Kart Racer down the line, which is kind of weird, but for now at least, if you're craving some vertical shoot-em-up action but with a villainous twist, Time Bokan is the way to go, especially since you can play as a ship with a blade mustache, and let me tell you, it really doesn't get more video gamey than that.
You will provide.
1990X 年、世界は核の炎に包まれた。
Rounding out today's episode, we have another game with a very long name, and it's Hokuto no Ken Seikimatsu Kyūseishu Densetsu, which made it to the PlayStation in October of the year 2000, and if you can believe it, this game has the exact same number of letters in it as the Time Bokan game, which is an incredibly unlikely thing to happen. This game was chosen for us today by two fine folks, them being Guildmaster Dan and now two-time winner Tio Jurek, who have kindly gifted us a fun game about punching dudes really hard and also making them explode, which I think we can all agree we love to see. Yes, it's none other than Fist of the North Star, specifically Fist of the North Star, Legend of the End of the Century Savior. Now, there is a completely different Fist of the North Star game that made it onto the console in 1996 that's more of a graphic novel with a turn-based battle system thing going on and would probably make for a very uninteresting segment, so luckily I've confirmed that this later 2000 release is the Fist of the North Star game I'm supposed to be talking about today, and after I've played it, I can certainly see why. Now, before we dive in, if you don't know, Fist of the North Star was an 80s manga and anime series, and easily one of the most popular and influential of its day. Set in a post-apocalyptic 90s future ravaged by nuclear war, this is essentially a series created out of a love of Mad Max and Bruce Lee movies, and really that's all you need to know to sell the series. It's just incredibly imposing buff dudes dressed like absolute freaks, punching and kicking each other in incredibly entertaining ways, most notably by using pressure points to make people straight up explode, which is frankly incredible. Naturally, as a very popular series debuting in the 80s, which is peak video game time, the series has seen plenty of adaptations over the years, covering a wide variety of genres from beat-em-ups to fighting games, role-playing games, games where you just punch things a whole lot, and I even think this is the only series to receive both a Warriors and Yakuza spin-off, which really does tell you a lot. Sadly, most of these games were exclusive to Japan, but at least we got the Warriors and Yakuza games, and Black Belt. Everybody loves Black Belt. So yeah, this 2000 release we're looking at today was the very first 3D Fist of the North Star game, and was a release from publisher Bandai and developer Natsume, who you might remember previously from the Super Sentai beat-em-up fighters that I covered back in Volume 14 that were really quite good. And to be honest, I haven't really considered it, but Natsume really did make a lot of very good games over the years. I mean, who am I to deny the power of Wild Guns and Shatterhand? And since Fist of the North Star here is a 3D beat-em-up fighter hybrid, something that they've proven they can do pretty well already, well, things on paper sound quite promising, so let's see how it holds up. Now, immediately off the bat, we've got to talk about the presentation here, which is honestly some of the best and most ambitious you'll see on the console. Like, Natsume games generally look quite nice, especially their later PS1 releases, but the detail and size of the characters in this game is really quite impressive. It uses the painted texture method similar to games like Mega Man Legends and Dr. Slump to give it that convincing anime style, but the difference here is the complexity and detail of the models. I mean, making a game look like that anime is a lot harder given the art style of the series and the larger proportions of the characters, but they somehow managed to pull it off, not only giving us some of the most impressive looking models for regular looking people in any PlayStation game, but the giant dudes with bulging muscles and abs. I mean, the level of detail on this shit is just insane for the PlayStation, and it pretty much wows you immediately as you boot up the game, because you're greeted to a shot-for-shot recreation of the anime's opening sequence, complete with the iconic theme music played throughout, which I desperately want to show you in full because it really is so good. But unfortunately, playing anime opening music doesn't just cut the ad revenue, which I don't really care too much about, but more importantly, it can also get a video blocked in some countries, and that I do care about. So here's a few seconds of it that will hopefully dodge the bots so you can at least get a taste. See? That was pretty great, right? Well, things are only going to get better, because while this game for the most part is a pretty traditional beat-em-up gameplay-wise, this thing is in fact a retelling of the first series of the anime, all done in engine, featuring most of the original cast of the show, and oh yeah, it also has a bunch of beat-em-up segments throughout where you fight big buff dudes, and a lot of people will explode. Don't you worry about that. So essentially, how the game works is that over the course of 8 chapters, you will sit back, relax, and watch the story of Fist of the North Star play out, but in fun, abridged PS1 form, and they really do go all out here, trying to give you a fully cinematic recreation of the series. Like, we've already talked about the character models and graphics, which are very impressive in their own right, but there's really quite a lot of care put into the camera angles, the cinematography, the music, the backgrounds. Like, this whole thing just reeks of effort from start to finish. I mean, it can sometimes feel like the PlayStation is buckling under the weight of its ambition from time to time, but this really does feel like you're watching an anime play out, but in cool PS1 graphics. And I gotta say, this game is easily one of the best to ever attempt this style. Of course, given the name of the series, Fist of the North Star isn't always about talking. There is a lot of punching and kicking too, and if at any point in the story a fight breaks out, that's when it's time to pick up the controller and start wailing on some dudes, and my god, is it fun. The battles in this game pretty much play like your old school side-scrolling beat 'em up. Think your Final Fight or Streets of Rage, but more in a arena setting, which is to say combat is very simple and mostly made up of a small but satisfying selection of punch and kick combos. But instead of scrolling along to the left and right, you just beat up a fun selection of enemies in different closed arenas until they're all dead. Occasionally you might get into a big 1v1 fight, which is more or less the same thing, only your opponent now has a health bar and they are much more likely to fuck you up. But either way, you press a lot of buttons, cool stuff happens. It's pretty great. Now the game only uses 3 buttons, one for punching, one for kicking, and one for jumping, and most of your attacks are simple 3 or 4 hit string combos unleashed by pressing a variety of punch and kick inputs, and you get even more moves by attacking while dashing or running, and even by pressing the punch and kick buttons simultaneously, which is how you do most of the best moves, like kicking people a silly amount of times. Outside of that, you can also block by holding punch, which has a little block gauge under your health bar that stops you from spamming it too much, and as is tradition, there's also an overpowered move that drains your health slightly in the form of an unblockable spin kick off the ground. And last but not least, you can also do this ridiculously fun jump by jumping while running or dashing. This is legitimately quite useful for closing distance or escaping danger, but it's also so fun to do that you'll probably just spam it a lot anyway. And yeah, that's pretty much the bread and butter of combat in this game. There's no grabs, no complicated inputs to remember, no leveling up system. It's very easy to pick up and play, and while certainly not the most fleshed out or technical combat system you'll see, the fluidity and snappiness of the combat, alongside all the little audio and visual flourishes, make combat in this game so satisfying and impactful that you don't even really mind having a limited moveset, since every move you do just absolutely wrecks lads. And good news, on occasion, you do get to play as different characters throughout the story, and they've each got their own movesets and combos to keep things feeling fresh. Of course, you might have seen a few dudes exploding during all that gameplay there, and wonder to yourself, how does that work? How can I make dudes explode? And luckily the answer to that is quite easily. When enemies attack, sometimes they'll flash during their attack animation, and if you land an attack on them at any point during this time, they will instantly explode. Well, the regular grunts anyway. This game has 2 different types of grunts, regular, which is most of them, and the red grunts, which are the extra tough ones. Now, video games have always taught me to be a little bit wary of people dressed in red, since they're always a little bit more likely to kill you. Now, these guys take a bit longer to kill the regular way, but if you manage to hit these guys while they're flashing, you'll enter into a little combo minigame where you have to match the direction of the fists that appear on screen by using the 4 face buttons, and if you manage to input the sequence in time, you'll be greeted to an incredibly gory kill and death cry from the enemy. And there are a lot of these, by the way, and you will never get sick of them. Better still, these attacks are so powerful, the shockwave emanating from the enemy's death also explodes any regular enemies caught in the AoE, and better still, it also recovers a portion of your health. So things really just can't get any better. Now, this is the only way to recover your health in-game, by the way, so there is purpose to doing this other than just being a sick freak who likes seeing people explode, but let's be fair, it's mostly just for sick freaks who like seeing people explode. As for the boss fights, well, these are more or less the same, only you have to drain an enemy's health bar before you make him explode, but the best attack sequences are saved for these guys, and once again, there is a lot of them, and they are always a treat. I mean, look at the belly texture that they've used here. This is absolute cinema. Now, as the game goes on, more enemies will be introduced that make your life a bit trickier, and luckily a lot of the archetypical beat-em-up bad guys do fit quite nicely into the world of Fist of the North Star. I mean, I still hate motorbike enemies, but at least it makes sense why they're here. And also the input strings for your big attacks do get a lot trickier as the game goes on, requiring not only faster inputs, but also a little bit of memorization, as some of the icons will start spinning before they set into place, and it's something that will definitely catch you off guard a few times throughout the game. And yeah, outside of the rare minigame here and there, that's pretty much the Fist of the North Star gameplay experience in a nutshell. Now, sadly the campaign is single player only given its story-driven nature, but if you manage to beat the game's 8 chapters without continuing, you'll unlock all the boss characters for play in versus mode, which, let's be fair, every beat 'em up benefits from having. And while personally I think the game would have benefited from at least a few levels that didn't just feel like a fighting arena, the combat here is just so fun that you really don't mind. I always think if a beat 'em up looks good, sounds good, and feels good, and that's pretty much all you need, and Fist of the North Star certainly ticks all those boxes. Although, with that being said, I can't really recommend this game as a traditional pick up and play arcade style beat 'em up, because don't forget, the purpose of this game is to retell the entire first series of the anime up until Kenshiro's final battle with Rao, and to get there takes about 5 hours of gameplay, which probably doesn't sound like a long time nowadays, but for a PS1 game, that's on the longer side of things. But for a beat 'em up, that is incredibly long, and the reason it takes so long is that altogether this game is about 20 to 25% fighting gameplay and 75 to 80% cutscenes, which I think as a complete package and concept for a game is really done quite well here. But a single chapter in this game from beginning to the point where you can finally save takes on average about the same amount of time your average arcade beat 'em up will take to complete in full. And also, if you add in that the cutscenes are unskippable, and there's a good chance a few of you out there, including me, can't read or speak Japanese, well then what is undoubtedly a big strength and selling point of this game also makes it a tough sell for people just hoping for a pick up and play beat 'em up experience. I mean, there most certainly is one contained within this game. It's just that you've got to sit through 5 to 10 minutes of cutscenes between fights to get 2 to 3 minutes of gameplay, and then you just repeat that cycle again. And I think for some people that might be a deal breaker, but on the bright side, if you complete this game, you're then free to skip the cutscenes on every subsequent playthrough, so that is something at least. And also as a little treat, if you manage to beat every chapter in this game without continuing, you also unlock a fun high score mode where all your attacks immediately instigate a super attack, and like I said, this really never does get old. And probably the most interesting unlockable in this game is a mode that lets you edit the voice lines from every single cutscene in the game, allowing you to replace any line from any other character with another line from another character. Obviously, you'll only really get something out of this if you understand Japanese, but it's really quite a unique addition and something I could certainly see a few people having a lot of fun with.
でかくなったな小僧。
そして私は自ら目に薬を浴び。
And I suppose just circling back to the presentation, while it's undoubtedly incredibly impressive all round, I do have to mention that it often suffers from some very jittery models and textures, the odd bout of slowdown when a lot of characters are on screen, and some general PlayStation jankiness. But I'm still happy to see devs trying to push the console to its limits, especially in the 2000s, and the fact that it runs at a stable 30 FPS most of the time and the game is almost entirely devoid of load screens is kind of a minor miracle in and of itself. Also, the sound, which we haven't really talked much about, is really excellent in this thing. The music and voice actors are from the show, so it's as authentic an experience as you can get. And once again, Natsube's ability to make combat feel fun and snappy thanks to the visual and audio cues is really one of their biggest strengths as a developer, and it really goes a long way into making the combat feel and look as good as it does. So from an audio-visual perspective, once again, there's very little to fault here. It's just a game where everything looks and sounds cool and absolutely does justice to the source material in a way no other Fist of the North Star game has done before it. And to be honest, some of the later games even struggle to match.
まったく大丈夫なのかよ。
ん？なんだお前は。知ったところで誰に語ることもできぬ。
この野郎、いい度胸だ。
強がっていられるのもこれまでだ。これで貴様の逃げ場はなくなった。
まだわからんか。死ぬのはお前だ。
今こそ北斗神拳の神髄を見せてやるわ。
腐った貴様が北斗神拳を使いこなすことはできん。
カサンドラ伝説は不滅。
墓穴が狭すぎたな。
体が殺
しかし、じきにちょうどよくなる。安心して死ね。
So yeah, all in all, another really fun licensed anime tie-in game on the PlayStation, and one of the more unique beat-em-ups of its era. I think the focus on creating a story-driven experience and fleshing it out with some simple but highly enjoyable gameplay kinda reminds me a little of a proto-Asura's Wrath or something, and while I think this particular focus on story limits the game's appeal to non-Japanese speakers and folks looking for a more fast-paced or in-depth experience, there's no doubt the ambition on display, and Natsume's clear love and reverence for the source material makes for yet another standout Japan-only exclusive on the PlayStation. Personally, I'd say unless you can speak Japanese or are a big Fist of the North Star fan, you may be better off waiting for a potential fan translation of this game to really appreciate the whole thing. And while that does seem like a big ask considering the amount of dialogue in this lad, quite recently an Italian translation did appear for this game because, as we learned previously, Italians love cool anime, and this Italian patch is really quite impressive. They even added the Italian opening theme to the game, which is such a cool little touch and much less likely to get me a copyright strike, and that we do love to see. So hopefully someday this game might see a patch in your language of choice, but either way, if you're looking for a game with long, beautiful cutscenes, buff men, a large amount of Bruce Lee noises, and also the ability to make dudes explode, well, this is the game for you. Or maybe check out Chowaniki, that oddly features most of those things too.
ちょっと待って。ねえ、ちょっと。
そこで少し頭を冷やすがいい。
助けろ。
Well, that's about it for yet another volume of Japan-only PlayStation games. A pretty fun volume, I must say. Well, at least if you're playing the games, I have no idea what it's actually like to watch one of these videos, because if you spend as long as I do editing them, the last thing you want to do is watch them. So I hope it's been fun. We got to check out one of the other runner games out there, which is saying a lot since every runner game seems to be a little bit odd. A game that features a lot of cool transformations and less cool controls, a beautiful 2D shoot-em-up that pioneered the use of tandem bicycles in the genre, and finally, probably the goriest beat-em-up on the PlayStation, and also probably the most dramatic. A great selection of games, if I do say so myself, but how good are they? Well, that's what the old arbitrary ranking system is for, and you might have noticed it's been adjusted slightly to fit a few more games into a certain section, and that's because all 4 of today's games I have deemed well worth trying. How incredibly boring of me. Oh No is a very fun example of the runner genre with some pretty cool ideas in the gameplay department. I still think it's kind of limited by the simplicity of the genre itself, which isn't really a fault of the game, but I know some folks don't really gravitate towards this particular style of game, and since Oh No is one of the trickier games in this style, it's not one that I think will win over any naysayers. But in saying that, I think the main reason for playing Oh No, at least for me, is the audio-visual experience and just the overall weirdness of the thing. It might be a bit too weird for me at times, but even still, if this looks like your jam, Oh No is a very easy recommendation from me. You might even say Oh yes. As for Time Bokan, this is kind of the same story. It's a game that absolutely excels in the audio and visual department and is one of the most colorful and upbeat vertical scrolling shooters I've played on the console. Although I do think the gameplay, while very solid, is one of the more simple shooters out there mechanically, which at least for me holds it back from being a top tier choice on the console. But for Time Bokan fans, shoot 'em up fans, or just fans of fun flashy arcade games, once again, this is another very easy recommendation, and one that I will definitely come back to in the future. I mean, come on, you get to fight a giant robot dog. That's just good shit. And similarly when it comes to Fist of the North Star, this is just good shit. A really simple, easy to play beat 'em up with incredibly snappy and satisfying combat. But what really sells the game is the production quality and ambition on display here. I mean, this is a Hokuto no Ken game for Hokuto no Ken fans. And while the decision to keep the game heavily story-centric and cutscene focused may be a turn-off for some and make the game a little less import-friendly than the average beat-em-up, I'd still say if you're a fan of beat-em-ups, Fist of the North Star, or just want to experience one of the prettiest PlayStation games around, once again, this is a very easy recommendation from me. And finally, we have Speed Power Gunbike, which I've chosen to discuss last because objectively, this is by far the worst of the games we've looked at today, but it's also the one that's stuck with me the most. It was a really interesting, frustrating, and rewarding game to play and review. I mean, it has so many issues, but also so many high points and things that I loved, and I kind of feel at odds with myself simply trying to pigeonhole this game into a particular category for review, because honestly, I believe this is a game that, depending on the type of person playing it, could be anything from a must-play to a bottom-of-the-barrel trash experience, and pretty much everything in between. And there's something really exciting to me about that. And if that sounds kind of exciting to you too, then by all means, go out of your way to try this. Just go in knowing to expect a bit of a learning curve and see where the journey takes you. It will likely involve you crashing into things in a mecha whole bunch, but hey, that's just part of life sometimes, you know? And honestly, it is pretty awesome. Now, before we finish up, I'd of course like to give a shout out to the wheels chosen for this episode. So give it up to Naveed Mohebi for Oh No, Gino746 Chasing Perspective, and Chris Cash Money for Speed Power Gunbike, Raulito1 for Time Bokan, and last but not least, Guildmaster Dan and Tio Jurek for Hokuto no Ken. Congrats on being the wheels chosen, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. I'd also like to give a very special shout out and thank you to my lovely camera shy fiance Orla, who once again returned to provide some co-op footage for this video. She had a hard time picking a favorite game between Time Bokan and Fist of the North Star, but she did beat me in a round of Fist of the North Star, and that was good enough to get that game the Orla stamp of approval. Great job. And of course, I've got to give a big shout out to the lovely lads and lassies over on patreon.com whose support continues to make videos like these possible, including fine folks like AC502, Alan Caslin, Alias McDoe, Bleeding Cart, Bloody Cassie, Callow Mellow, Clumbombs, Danny, Dave the Boy Nolan, Discon, the mascot for the Famicom Disc System, Doma, Etchy Gamer, Fragile Traveler, Globe99, Ice Light, Jared Bynum, Johnbo81, Karuran, Kyle Winter, Life Sword, Mr. Popala, Moomin Biscuit, Trans Rights Are Human Rights, Mr. the Joshmon, Ms. Cat, My Pal Robot, Nathan McMullen, Nick Norman, Richard Kramer, SN Kierstead, Cyano, Spectre117, and Tolkoto, who've all subscribed at the Fan++ tier. And finally, last but not least, a big thank you to you at home or wherever you are for watching the video. I sure do hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back real soon with some more PlayStation goodness, but until then, take it easy, be good to one another, and I'll talk to you again real soon. See ya!